Welcome to Office 2016 video number 38. Hey, in this video, we want an introduction to what a database is and to the Access Microsoft database. Here are our topics, and I want to go to our web page. When you download the actual Access database, it's in a zip folder, so you have to download it and unzip it. There's an Excel file just so we can remind ourselves what a proper data set is. And unlike the past handouts, this is the one time that the handout is going to be in a PowerPoint presentation, not a PDF file.
So Access. Hey, Access is a database. And the definition of a database? Hey, stores raw data. Any database has to store raw data. And instead of storing raw data all together, you always have to break it apart into its smallest pieces. So instead of storing an address like this, you would store the address, the city, the state, and the zip code separately. And the reason why is so we can ask questions of the raw data. If I don't have the state separated into its own individual cell, it's really hard to ask the database, show me all the information from New Mexico or from Washington. Same with zip codes. You might want to sort or filter by a certain zip code. So you always got to store raw data in its smallest pieces. Notice over in Excel, we've already talked about what these at the top are. These are field names. Databases will also have field names. Hey, number 2 in the definition of database, store raw data. Well, what do we do with all that raw data? We create useful information from the raw data to help make decisions. So we're always going from raw data to useful information. Hey, we saw this over in Excel also. Anytime we did what we call data analysis, that's this, from raw data into useful information. All right, examples of databases. How about here at Highline? Highline stores raw data about, well, how about students? They have ID, name, email, grades, and lots of other information. Now, one important thing and difference between a database and our study in Access as compared to Excel is we will always have what's called a unique identifier or primary key. So here at Highline, your student ID, there is only one. And so all the information about you gets stored in one place. And that's because we have student ID, a unique identifier. There are no duplicate IDs. Hey, so we could store information on student and also instructors, things like ID, name, email, and salary. How do we go from storing this raw data to creating useful information? Well, Highline might do that when it calculates just the GPA for business students or just the GPA for nursing students. Or how about when all the students are signed up for fall? Well, when they create that list of student names, emails for a particular class and give that to an instructor, that's going from all of the raw data to some useful information. That report of what students are in the class and what their email address is useful information for the teacher. Hey, what about Google? Google also stores lots of raw data. In fact, every click you ever make, what you typed into the search engine, as soon as you type something in, it's stored in a database. What you clicked on, how you misspelled a word. So you misspelled a word and then clicked on something later, which is the correct spelling. Google keeps all of that. So this is the raw data, and from that raw data, Google might create useful information. Hey, what ad to display? Most frequent links clicked on after the word Seattle is typed. You know, when you type something in to Google, it immediately suggests some popular links. That's a form of data analysis, going from all the stored raw data information to creating something useful, like maybe people that type Seattle then type weather or pizza or something like that. Hey, correct spellings. Google also keeps all of that. So that's how come at the top when you misspell something, it immediately has a suggestion. And that's based off of lots of raw data. So those are two examples of keeping raw data and then creating useful information from that raw data. Hey, storing raw data to useful information. We actually want to go back and look at a file here in just a moment. We want to remind ourselves about what we did in Excel. We always talked about a proper data set in Excel. Remember, field names at the top and records in subsequent rows. Well, it's going to be the exact same in Access in our database. We're going to have field names and then records and rows. And remember, field names are important because a field name says what sort of data gets to go in the column, whether it's a date or a name or an ID. What do we do in Excel? We had our proper data set, and from our raw data, we created useful information. That was our definition of data analysis in Excel. Create useful information from raw data to help make decisions. It's the same in Access. We'll just have different ways of creating that useful information. Remember, over in Excel, we used formulas like SUMIFs, and we did sorting, filtering, and pivot tables. Those were all examples of data analysis. Now, in Access, we're going to have a proper table, what we called a proper data set over in Excel, but a table. The heart of any database is a table. That's where you store the raw data. Of course, field names will be in the first row. However, over in Access, we're going to have more robust ways of saving that raw data. We're, in fact, going to add safeguards or data validation to make sure that bad data doesn't go into our database. If you have bad data going in, then when you go to create useful information, you create maybe not very useful information. So we're going to have things like data type. We will define what kind of data can go in a field. Is it a number? Is it text? We'll also have many field properties that will restrict the type of data that can go into our fields in our table. Now, each record must have a unique identifier called a primary key. That's different. Over in Excel, we didn't have a primary key. We could have, but we didn't. Here in Access, when we build our tables to store our raw data, we're always going to have a unique identifier called a primary key. This will help prevent duplicates. Imagine if your student ID, if there was more than one of them, then some of your grades would get sent to one place and other of your grades would get sent to another place. And that would not be good. We want all the information about that one student stored in the same place. So that will be our primary key. We'll also have records in subsequent rows, of course, just like we did in Excel. And we'll do data analysis. We will use something called a query. We will build our queries. That's where we ask a question of our raw data, like calculate GPA for business students, or give me the list of all of the students in Business 216. We will actually use queries. Remember, over in Excel, we did sorting, filtering, pivot tables. Those are all examples of queries. We didn't call them queries, but they're questions we had to organize from the raw data into useful information. So we'll use queries, and then from the queries, we'll build reports. Not only that, but we'll be able to build relationships between tables. That way we can create, when we create our useful information, we can create our useful information from more than one table at a time. Now we want to actually go over and look at our Excel example and our Access example. So I'm going to go over to Excel. This is straight. This was our definition of proper data set over in Excel, and this was an example we have straight from our class. So we could take field names in the first row, records in subsequent rows. If we were to go up to the data and turn on filter, we could do a type of question. I don't want to see all the raw data. I just want to see the records for Amazon. So I could use my filter and uncheck, and then only check Amazon. What we're doing is we're asking a question of our data set. When I click OK, there's my answer. Now I can go and analyze the Amazon records. That is a proper data set. Our tables over in Access will look very similar. We won't have a filter button like this. We'll build our query in a different way, but the idea is the same. Now let's go over to Access and look at Access for our first time. Now here's Access. It's a database, and there's a bunch of different objects stored in the database. All of these objects together constitute the database. Now here's the 4 different type of objects that we're going to learn about in Access. Tables. Tables are the heart of any database. This table right here, products, that stores all the raw data for products. This table here, supplier data, it holds all the data, the raw data for suppliers. Now, to open up an object, this is called the navigation pane. And by the way, I have mine grouped by object, tables, queries, forms, reports.
We can use the drop down and select
Tables and related views. When I select table and related views, it only shows me two groups. That means supplier data table, products table. The table is at the top. All the other objects are based off of the table. Now I'm going to go back and say object type. All right, so let's look at a table. Double click and open this up. Wow, kind of looks like Excel, right? But it's not. It's definitely Access. Look at the field names at the top. Product ID, description, on-hand cost, selling price, supplier code, and whether or not they're wholesale or retail. This is the primary key. Each one of these toys, and this is a products database for toys. We're selling toys like midget railroads, pets jigsaw, railway bridge. But each one of these toys is a unique record, and so it has a unique identifier, a primary key. So coal car, the code is CC14. Now think of this primary key here just like your student ID at Highline, right? If this was your name, it would have all of the information about you and related information, but your student ID would be the unique identifier. All right, so tables. Field names in the top, records in subsequent rows. The difference is that we will build this table and add lots of data validation, data types, and field properties to make sure that only proper data goes in here. For example, only a number goes into the cost field. You can't type in text, or only 4 characters go into the product ID. All right, I'm going to close this. The X is way over here. So the products table, here's queries. Queries we're going to build. The only way queries, forms, and reports can exist is if there's a table first. Now, before we talk about a query, let's talk about a form. All a form is a user interface. Now, before I open up products form, let's just open up the table. That's the raw data. I'm going to close it. The user interface, if I double click products form, it's just a fancy place. It sits on top of this table here, and this is where you enter or change the data. Down here I could click forward to move through the records, or I could do Control F to find a particular record. When you go up to Highline registration, they ask for your student ID, and the person at the window uses a form to look into the table
to get the raw data. This is getting the raw data for fire truck.
I'm going to close this form. Remember, the form is just a user interface. It's as if the form is sitting in front of the products table. Here we can see all the raw data. The form is just a user interface. Here's the user interface for supplier data. We enter in the raw data for the supplier. Oh, and we'll see this amazing feature here. So supplier data form knows that the AP supplier is selling these products here. Close this form. All right, so we have forms. They sit on top of the tables and allow us to look in the table and change data. Let's go look at a query. Each one of these. In fact, before we even look at Access Query here, let's go over to Excel. Remember, we used a filter and filter to show all of the Amazon records. Here, if I double click this query, it's actually a query based on the products table, and the question we asked of this products table was show me only the toys for SC. So if I go over to the products table and double click it,
here's all the raw data.
I'm going to ask a question. Please show me only SC toys. We will see how to create this query later, but this is the end result. This is the after we ask the question, this is the answer we get. This is a simple example of a query in Access. Another example, inventory value. Let's go look at the table here. Notice we have on hand and cost, but there's no inventory value. To calculate inventory value, one way to do it, and this toy company does that, is on hand times cost. Hey, that sounds like a formula over in Excel, But in Access, we use a query. So if I double click this, it shows me the answer. There's the inventory value. Again, we're asking a question of the raw data. Please show me inventory value. We will see how to create this later. So we have tables, and then the forms, which sit on top of the tables, and then the queries. That's asking a question of the raw data. The final object we're going to study is a report. Inventory value, all it is, it's a fancy report based on this query. So I've created this, and we'll see how to create this later. I'm going to double click and open it, and you can see there is our report. It's just making it fancy for printing out based on that query. 1, 2, 3, 4, those are the objects that we will study in Access. Now, let's see something absolutely amazing about Access. Let's say we want to open up the products form. Remember, this is the user interface that's sitting on top of this products. I'm going to change on hand for Barnyard Friends. It's not 3, it's 13. Now, there's a couple different major differences between Access and the other programs we study like Excel and Word. One is when you're entering raw data, you do not have to save it. The actual raw data in a database is automatically saved. So watch this. I changed that 13. I'm going to close this. Remember, this is a form. That's the form sitting on top of there. So if this is really sitting on top, when I change this, it should automatically appear in the table. And it will. I close this form. I double click and open up the products, and you can see there it is. It automatically dumped that change from the form right into the table. The table is where we store all this raw data. We have changed a bit of raw data. Now, let me close this, and I'm actually going to close the database. And notice when I close the whole database, it did not ask me to save. So I'm back over here. If I double click in Windows Explorer to open it up, it never asked me to save. So when I open up the table, did it save? You betcha. So that's a big difference between Access and other programs. It's only the raw data that's automatically saved. If I were to change the structure of this table, like change the column width, watch what happens. And later we'll see you actually go to Design View to really change the structure of the object. But you can do simple things on the surface of the table. I changed the column width. Watch what happens when I close. I'm going to use the X over here and close it. It's going to be polite, just like all the other programs we studied, Excel, Word. If you forgot to save, it will remind you. Why? Because that wasn't raw data. That was a structural change. I'm going to say yes. All right, so one difference is that raw data is automatically saved, but when we create these objects, we'll have to manually save the actual object. Now, let's just see how amazing that is. We used the form for Barnyard Friends, and we changed it to 13. It rippled through into the table. See that 13? But what about the query, that inventory value? You betcha, it totally updated. We build these queries. We are always checking inventory value. So this is a regular question we're asking all the time. So in Access, we build the query once. Because it's connected to the table, anytime the raw data changes, it totally updates. So when we change the raw data, it ripples through our database. There it is. Oh, that's the inventory value. So right down at the bottom, Barnyard Friends. Totally amazing. Now, two other things about the difference between Access and the other programs. Notice if I were to go up to Open, or not notice because I'm not going to do it, it would actually, I'm going to click Escape, it would close this database and allow us to open up a different database. So from inside of Access, you can only open one database at a time. However, if you're in Windows Explorer and you had 5 different databases, you could double click on each one in Windows Explorer, and that would allow you to open up multiple databases. The last thing we want to talk about as a difference between Access and Excel and Word is undo. So I'm going to go to the Products form. I double click. I'm going to change this to 3, tab. I'm going to change it to 2, tab. I'm going to change it to 4, tab. undo will work on one record. So I'm going to use Control Z, and you can see that it undid that action. But undo, once you go on to the next record, undo will not work on the previous record. So undo will only work on the current record. Now that's not a problem because the whole point of the database is that we change it and it automatically saves here. Aha, so undo only works for one record. However, undo when you're changing the structure of the object will work as many times. So we'll see when we create all these objects, if we make mistakes, especially when we're building tables, which take a long time to build, undo works normally. There's many undos. All right. I'm going to close that object, and I'm going to close this database.
Now we're going to come back over to PowerPoint and talk about whether to use Access or Excel for data analysis. That is, converting and storing raw data into useful information. Well, Access has one huge advantage over Excel. In terms of storing the raw data, we can create more robust data validation. That means add a data type and field properties to prevent bad data from getting into the tables. Another advantage for Access is it's easier to build relationships between tables. Now, we did see relationships in the data model, but those are used for pivot tables. In Access, we'll build relationships from tables, and all objects will be able to see those relationships and pull data from any one of the tables. Another advantage for Access is complex queries can be easier to create in Access than in Excel. For example, if you want to pull just a certain supplier's items automatically, it's much easier to do with Access than it is with Excel. The formulas to do that are incredibly complex. If you had a choice, much easier to do in Access. Another huge advantage for Access, as we saw, queries automatically update when the raw data changes. Now, you can do things with sort and filter. You can even do some things with Power Query. But none of those will automatically update when source data changes. Another advantage for Access is if you have a query that you run often, like a regular inventory report, it may be easier to do in Access. Now, the caveat is there's this new tool, Power Query, and in our class, we only saw a couple of simple examples. But that definitely adds a new level of querying to Excel as compared to Access. Now, the real reason that we use Excel is simple queries such as sorting, filtering, and pivot tables are easier to do in Excel if it's a one-time deal. And the real reason, this is why Excel is the #1 used program on the planet Earth. On the fly, data analysis can be easier. Most people don't know Access, and if they need to filter to get to some particular records or build a pivot table to summarize with conditions or criteria, much easier to do in Excel than it is in Access for on-the-fly data analysis. That means we dump some data and we can do whatever we want. We don't have to build the official queries. We can just sort, filter, do a pivot table, and other data analysis features. Another important reason that Excel is so important is, hey, most people know how to use Excel at least a little bit to deal with raw data. Another point that is not as applicable in this class of why we might want to use Excel rather than Access is some data modeling done with Power Query and Excel's data model can be easier to accomplish than Access. We didn't see any of the examples in this class, but there are some examples that we'll see in Business 218, Spreadsheet Construction, or at YouTube, it's the Highline Excel class. And BI 348, this will be a new class that I will create, and the videos will be at YouTube in spring of 2018. In those two classes, we see that there are some clear advantage for Power Query and the Excel's data model as compared to Access. And the main one is that it can hold more data more efficiently than Access can. All right, but The bottom line is the combination of the two is good. We can store the raw data in Access and assure that the data going into our tables is usable, good data. And then we can send raw data to Excel as needed. Now, one other important note. Access is a small database. Most large businesses do not use Access to store their raw data. They have custom-built systems by SAP or Oracle or other database systems. Oftentimes, Access is used as a small database, or maybe they export some data from the main system to Access. All right, now we want to go to our next slide.
The four important objects in Access, well, the table, that's the heart of any database. None of the other objects come into existence unless you have a table that stores the raw data. Forms, just a user interface. It's an easy way to deal with one record at a time. Queries, that's where we're going to ask our questions of our database. And then reports, for us, are just going to be making the query results that we get nice for printing. Last slide here, some of the differences. While in Access, you can only have one database open at a time. No problem. Multiple databases, you want them open up, use Windows Explorer and double-click each file. Save, when you enter raw data, it's automatically saved, but you have to use the Save button or Control S anytime you create or change the structure of any of the objects. And then finally, undo and redo. Only works when you're working on a record before it's saved, before you move on to the next record, or creating objects, of course. If you have many things you want to undo, undo will work the same when you're actually creating the object or creating or changing the structure of the object. This is our last slide. So here's our last slide. We've got to talk about the two views for each object. Hey, wait a second. We have four objects. Table, form, query, report. Regular view, that's what we were looking at. Data sheet view for the table and data sheet view for the query. That's where we saw all the raw data for the table or our answer. Form view, that's where we actually changed that 3 to a 13. And then print preview. Print. These are the regular views. Our other view is design view. I call this the underneath view because we can actually go under the table or the query and really change the structure. So we want to go look at these two views, regular view and then design view. Regular view is how we use the table. Design view is where we go to create. Now for us, design view, we're going to be using design view for table and for query. We're basically going to be clicking a single button or using a wizard to create our form and report, so we won't really have to go to design view. All right, let's go over and look at what we mean. Here's a table. Navigation pane, I'm going to double click. This opens up in regular view or data sheet view, but look it up here, home, ribbon, views. There's a drop down, data sheet and design. Now when we click design, it's going to look really strange. Notice the field names are in the first row. This is how we see it. This is how we look at our table, but when we create it, I'm going to click design view here now. Oh, our field names are listed vertical, and for any given field name, cost, we have to say what type of data type it is and what are the field properties, some of the data validation rules. So for this first product ID, we've decided to have text as our data type, and then the field properties down here, very important. We're only allowed 4 characters. That greater than symbol means we have to use caps, and this LL00 means you have to enter 2 letters and then 2 numbers. That's a type of data validation. It means we're preventing bad data from going into our database. And notice I'm in design view. I can come up here, and this is actually a toggle. I can see the table, go back to design view. See the table, back to design view. Sometimes it's helpful to toggle back and forth as you're creating your object. All right, it doesn't matter which view you're in. You can close it either way. All right, our queries, if I double click inventory value, there's what we see. This is our data sheet view. If I click the design button, the drop down, I'm going to say data sheet or design. Wow, look at that. There's our field list, and this is where we go to create our question. There is an actual formula, and we'll talk about that later. So this is design view, and we'll learn all about this later. This is where we go to create or change the structure of our query. 2 views. For our form and our reports, I'm going to double click. Up here, there's a drop down. We're going to use either form or layout. Layout is this kind of halfway where it's convenient to change like column widths. But for us, we're going to use a built-in standard form, so pretty much all we need to use is form view. I'm going to close this object, the form, and then for inventory value report, double click. I'm actually in report view, which is very similar to print preview. That's how it looks like when it's printing. Notice I'm in print preview. I'm going to close this. We will use this in-between layout view to change some column widths. If we wanted to go underneath and change it, we're not going to do that in this class. We would use design view. All right, so we're going to either use layout view for reports or report or print preview, either one of those. All right, so I'm going to close this. We've seen our tables, queries, forms, and reports. Those are the objects in our databases. In our next video, when we come back, we'll actually create the database and create our first table, which will be this products table. All right, we'll see you next video.